Back in 1998, there was an asteroid movie that everybody talked about. One that, with its over-the-top storyline, acting, and romance, people either loved or hated it. There was no in-between. This, however, is not that film. This is the other asteroid film, Deep Impact. Is it the better of the two, or does it fall into the same shortcomings? Let's find out. The differences between the two are no greater than here. While one is focused on an over-the-top premise and storyline, Impact Story takes a much more subtle look at the situation, specifically through the eyes of select individuals. 3 to be specific: the boy who made the discovery, the President of the United States, and the reporter that broke the story. Yes, rather than telling an over-the-top story with a ridiculous premise, Impact tried to take a different angle to the destruction of mankind by focusing on 3 separate stories that indirectly cross due to the oncoming event. How well they are done varies dramatically. The cover-up arc, for instance, was very interesting and done well enough that it perked my interest in such possibilities. Especially the idea that our government would invent a cover story to hide evidence of world destruction from the public in order to prevent the inevitable chaos and economic collapse that the end of the world would bring. I just wish they would have done more with it.
I always thought the truth was in the nation's best interest.
On the other hand, those concerning the boy and his family were not as good. It's not to say they were done poorly, but their family and their girlfriend did little to stand out, and seemed only to be there to add more drama to the boy's arc. Not to mention some of it just felt far too forced. And those that centered around the space crew varied as well, but for the most part felt genuine. Especially the way that Impact focused more on the relationship between the younger pilots versus the more experienced veteran assigned to their group than a typical superhero crew. The whole situation came off far more believable than I would have expected. Overall, I think the story came off quite well. While it is true that some of the scenes seem to be bogged down by the day-to-day events of certain characters, the later scenes made up for it. In fact, I would have to say that I enjoyed the story of Impact more than its competition. With that in mind, I give the story a well-deserved C. Nice job, guys. No world is complete without the characters that live within it. Let's see whose lives will be turned upside down by possible world destruction. Jenny Lerner. Jenny is the reporter that breaks the story of the century. Unfortunately for her, getting that story is neither fun nor glamorous. We see this as she is the understudy of a more experienced reporter who tends to dump extra work and dull stories onto Jenny. On top of this, she has to deal with divorced parents who do nothing but whine about their lives, especially her mother complaining that her father is getting married to a younger woman. Yes, even her father seems to be constantly complaining about his new life. Scene after scene, she sits in the background, forcing us to listen as her parents gripe and complain non-stop. And yet, while she plays backseat driver to both her supervisor and parents, she still manages to uncover the event that threatens to end human existence and, more importantly, elevate her career. From beginning to end, she did little to stand out and came off as either bland or whiny. So when she and her family finally met their fate, we were left with little to feel for her. Next up, we have Leo Biederman. Leo is the boy that discovers the comet. From what little we see of his life before the event, we can surmise that he likes the girl that lives next door. They appear to be just friends until he becomes a celebrity due to his discovery and the attention that it brings. Their budding romance is pushed to a new level when it is revealed that he and his family are on the list to be spared destruction along with a spouse. What follows is a silly bit of romance and drama when her family was not included as requested. And yet they are reunited again to escape destruction together. How romantic. Or not.
Alcor. Good, Peter.
Next up is Spurgeon Tanner. The veteran pilot assigned to the world-saving mission, Tanner does his best to relate to his younger companions. This goes about as well as expected, considering the drastic age gap between himself and his fellow astronauts. Both sides seem frustrated by the fact that he has been assigned, but Tanner goes along with it as a favor to one of his former space companions. The dynamic works well as the two sides feel each other out until they come together in the end as Tanner proves his worth to the team. And to wrap up the main cast, we have President Beck. Yes, it's Morgan Freeman doing what he does best, rocking the screen in roles of authority. He plays the role of president so well that it made me eager to see more from him. But no, we instead get more scenes with the others. And that would be fine were the rest of the characters interesting enough to carry the film. But unfortunately, most of what we are left with is generic and uninspired characters droning on about the pains of their lives, especially when it came to either family. And in the end, I didn't care one way or another what happened to Jenny or Leo's families. It felt as though both sets didn't need to be there at all, especially with all the pointless drama to make us feel sorry for them. And with that in mind, I would have to give the overall effort for the characters a D. With some more interesting characters and less dragged out storylines, the cast might have made a bigger impact. And what's a natural disaster film without the effects? If done poorly, a promised devastating flood can easily turn out to be nothing more than a puddle. Let's see how Impact does. As Impact is more character-driven than its more over-the-top counterpart, the effects get less screen time and effort. That's not to say they are bad, but neither are they great. Instead, the effects are somewhere in a range of serviceable. The space scenes look good enough, and the comet is fine, but nothing about it feels truly massive and amazing. They just seem to be background pieces there to hold the screen until we can see the next character-driven drama. Simply put, they were not strong enough to enhance the film. This is especially apparent when the great tidal wave hit. In one scene it was big enough to envelop most of the buildings in New York, and yet in other locations the wave looked no more than 10 to 20 feet tall. And the oncoming wave in water was far less impressive as we watched our main character standing and watching before simply outrunning the water. Talk about disappointing. With that in mind, I'm forced to give the effects a well-earned D. A world on the brink of destruction. With the threat of chaos and anarchy, the government decides to cover it up until the day they are discovered, and upon that day we see a world that pretty much looks the same. That's right, even with the planet on the brink of chaos and economic collapse, we see none of that. There is no inner conflict for the president as he fights the urge to declare martial law, no scenes of soldiers struggling to maintain control, no sign of the people losing hope and protesting, no political unrest as the world puts pressure on the US and Russia to succeed in their single plan to save the world. No, all we get is a world where nothing changes. And that's a real shame. With all those plans at the beginning, by the end we could have seen the landscape hanging by a thread as those same astronauts desperately fought to save both the world and humanity. Now that would have been a worthy premise. Sadly, we get nothing of the sort. In this universe, nothing really changes, not even with the end of the world just around the corner. With that in mind, I give the setting a D for disappointing. Now for the big one, the complete package. How well did all the pieces come together in Impact? Not as good as I would have hoped. Now that's not to say the lack of flashy effects were the root of the problem, but the other pieces just did not do enough to make up for it. It's obvious they were trying to go a different direction with Impact, but there was just not enough there to make the transition between disaster film and drama. Many of the characters were either weak or not interesting enough to get the screen time that they did, and that led to some portions of the film that dragged on far more than they needed to as we got more and more involved in the same characters' lives, especially the learner parents and Leo's rather bland girlfriend. But the most disappointing part was that it had promise. The idea that the government would hide such an event to prevent confusion and unrest could have led to so many interesting outcomes. But here it did not. Once the news got out, nothing really happened. The world didn't come to a screeching halt, people didn't lose hope and turn to chaos. The story just seemed to lose steam halfway in and turned right into a generic action film. And with that generic turn of events, I'm forced to say, as a whole, Deep Impact gets a generic, disappointing D. They could have done so much better.